Thank you, thank you, Mark, and I'd like to also extend my thanks to all of our hosts here. We've had a wonderful stay and appreciate it, Professor Benveniste and Professor Schmidt and the others who've made our stay here so wonderful, actually, and it's a delight to be here. So I am going to talk a little bit about what I would call generating a public health impact. A lot of Mark's conversation has been about making policy choices. Should we do this or should we do that? But there's another part of policy that has to do with, now that we have something we've decided to do, how are we going to do it? How are we going to create, from a political perspective, for example, fewer foster children in the U.S.? That's a goal that virtually every state, the nation has. We would like to count fewer children in foster care next year than we have this year. And then how do we go about that? It represents the kind of value choices that Mark already talked about, but now we have the very significant problem of demonstrating success at the sort of public health level. And in the U.S., just to be very brief, policy and practice favor fewer children coming into care and sending more children home. And if we manage those two things appropriately, we will succeed in lowering the number of children in out-of-home care. Big question is, how do these choices or goals influence the allocation of resources? How much effort in human resources, capital, and other capacities are we going to direct towards either the front door of the system or the back door of the system or both?
Well, the question is sending more children home and preventing out-of-home placement an economic issue or an ideological issue? Is it to save money for the state, or is it to ensure children's well-being?
Well, it's about both, but we've sort of gotten past that part of the debate. Now we have very practical issues to face. The political process has made its choices, all right? And so now policymakers at the executive branch, not the legislative branch, the executive branch has to decide how to take whatever value statements have come forward through legislation, policy, regulation, and implement that in a way that delivers on the promise of the choices that folks have been making. And so it's very much a case of everyone would like to reduce the impact of AIDS, HIV, and we now have very good treatments for at least minimizing the impact. So the efficacy question has been essentially dealt with. The question now is, how do we distribute efficacious interventions in places like sub-Saharan Africa? It's a delivery problem, not an efficacy problem. And so we have to come to some understanding. And the nature of evidence required to help with those decisions is vastly different than the nature of evidence in the case of clinical trials and the essential question of efficacy. And it's not a question of either or, it's a question of how do we braid together in the appropriate order these various types of intervention or various types of evidence so that we can make progress as a society. So I'm going to take these basic issues of fewer children coming into care and send more children home and ask the question, where should we put our effort? So I'll ask a simple question, when do children go home? Because when children go home, you want them to go home safely. It shouldn't be simply about the money. You want that decision to reflect the best interests of the children and the families. And so it might be helpful to know just when do children go home? So we answered this question in the U.S. I think you can see that. This is a large number of states. It's the number of children leaving out-of-home care by month over a 10-year period. So we have 120 months. And it's each month the number of kids going home. It's as regular a pattern in data, in natural data, as one could expect to find. And what you're seeing there is that every year in the month of June, when schools let out, children go home from foster care. So if we were going to allocate resources in a way that reinforces those decisions, we would want more workers doing the work of getting kids home in the month of June than in the month of December. Why? Because there's For the very same reason that when you go to the grocery store on those peak hours, they have more people at the checkout counter. To manage the simple volume of work, the institutional patterns, as the way society comes together, create certain patterns, and you want to allocate resources in line with the natural ebb and flow of our societies. It's a very simple graph. There isn't a child welfare agency in the country that allocates resources according to this, even though in the midst of dramatic changes in the child welfare system in the U.S., we see this persistent pattern year in and year out. This is a form of evidence that should affect policymaking. It's not about values. The value decisions have already been made. It's about resource allocation at a time when you can have maximum impact on what happens to kids. That should be fairly clear. The next one is not going to be as clear. So now the question is, again, remember this, the policy choices have been made. I'd like to get kids home if they're in care, and I'd like to keep them from coming into care. So what we've done here is we've said, well, let's ask the question, how is the number of kids you let into out-of-home care related to the number of kids you let out? Do kids tend to go home quickly if you let lots of kids in? In places where you let few kids in, do they tend to go home more slowly? So what we've tried to do here is characterize two systems. To your left these are counties in a state. To your left are places that don't admit many kids to out-of-home care. They have below average rates of placement. To your right of the center line are places that have high rates of admission. Again, relative to the average. So you can national average. So you can see that there are indeed places where there are more kids coming in and more kids going out. More kids coming in. But in these particular cases, there's no real relationship with the rate at which they leave. So now if you want to try and manage the problem of too many kids in foster care, these are places where admissions to out-of-home care are more important than how quickly kids leave. So now we have places where we want to invest in preventing children from entering out-of-home care. Follow that? These are completely different places where the issues are, first of all, they have fewer counties, and the one on the bottom, those kids leave care very slowly. And the one on the bottom, the dots above the line indicate that those kids leave care at a rate that's faster than average. So here we have situations in which just the simple ins and outs of kids help us decide where to invest resources so that we'll have the maximum impact possible in the time that we have to achieve our goals. Again, this is not the result of evidence-based or clinical random trials. It's simply describing what is happening in the system. Kids coming, kids going. Where do we invest our resources in order to have a maximum amount of impact? Now, will clinical trials information help us decide how best to keep kids from coming in? That's the HIV question. Where do I invest resources in those evidence-based practices that prevent entry into care? Well, I would go back to this slide and suggest that I would want to invest most of those resources, not exclusively, but on balance in these areas right here. Why? Because on average, those are counties that let more children in when we compare all of these places to each other. Over here, the graph on the top, the impact is likely to be smaller. You don't want to ignore those places. There are kids coming into care. You might learn how they're keeping kids out. But there's no randomized trials going on here. This is simply observational data, and it's very important evidence with respect to this question of allocation and having public health impacts. If you prevent kids from coming into foster care, but you don't bother with the back door, the reunification process, the adoption process, as the case may be, and length of stay goes up, the population may not go down, even though you've solved the front door problem. Yes?
Recent media reports show or report that in the United States, 40% of children are in one-parent homes. I wasn't sure whether it was just single moms or it was just one parent. Has there been some research as to what is the extent of problems, whether it's foster care or reformatories or children and other problems from one-parent homes versus the customary two-parent homes?
In relationship to out-of-home care?
Out-of-home care and also other problems, juvenile delinquency and early crime and so forth.
Well,
Which is not the topic of today's discussion.
Right. Well, it's a bit off topic. So yes, there is research on those issues in relationship to the out-of-home care question. So, do places that have more children being raised in families headed by single parents, primarily females? So, if you go to those places, are you more likely to need more foster care? As it turns out, it is true that on average, places that have more single-parent families have more kids going into foster care. So that's another area in which one wants to concentrate resources to prevent out-of-home care, either clinically or in other ways related to pregnancy prevention. The choice now, how one accomplishes that, is a secondary matter. So, do you want me to just take this? We'll wrap it up here pretty quickly. So,
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay. So, not all policies can be assessed using randomized trials. And two examples that we have here are mandatory maltreatment reporting. In the U.S., certain professionals are required to report maltreatment. Is that the best way to capture the incidence of maltreatment in the community? Well, one way to deal with that would be to randomly assign reporters the responsibility. In one jurisdiction, randomly assign reporters normal responsibilities in the context of a community, and do that on a random basis, or do it by county. And the question of whether or not, the value choice really, is the information, the net improvement in the quality of information worth the additional risks that children could conceivably be confront with the use of randomized experiments, and that we have to make a choice as to whether or not, and I think many of us would make the choice that there are other ways to deal with the question of whether or not mandatory child maltreatment reporting is the best way for society to detect the kids who are in out-of-home care. Extending foster care past the age of 18. Here you have a situation in which the apparatus of government required to create the capacity to extend care. It's very hard to do that for a small part of the population and not do that for another part of the population, because so much infrastructure is required in order to do that. It's simply not practical at that scale to run randomized experiments. But again, to some extent, it's a value choice as to how one chooses the quality, relate to the fact that you get different kinds of information from different methods of collecting data. There are whole hosts of policies where you just the complexity of the underlying infrastructure required just is not amenable to the idea of running randomized trials. And the time required to get benefits. Decision making is made in real time. Legislative bodies, I've run several randomized clinical trials myself, and in the middle of it, a public administrator said, "I've seen enough, we're going to do that system-wide." And my pleas to the contrary, don't play with the experiment, we're in the middle of it, we have lots to learn, had absolutely no bearing whatsoever on the decision, the need to make a decision about political issues that that policymaker was confronting. So managing the real-time nature of the fact that life is not an experiment, life happens in real time, and administrators need to make real decisions. Yeah.
I would just interject that an even more common problem is that's a problem that Fred's mentioning, that they kind of abandon your experiment. A bigger problem with policy interventions is that they change the context. They change other things going on in the environment in ways that fundamentally change your comparison. And the folks who make those changes quite often are policymakers unrelated to the thing you're changing, right? So the welfare department can't tell the education department what to do. And so it's just very hard to use experiments to test very many policy changes.
So the principles and lessons with regard to evidence. In order to make sound decisions, we need a variety of information. Don't advantage one form of information over the other. We've had long conversations over the last couple of days. The key to the method is not the method, it's the question. Find your question. What is your question? And then find the method that best addresses that. For some things, observational data simply won't do the job. For other types of questions, randomized clinical trials will be much better, particularly where they get to the issue of clinical efficacy, where you have a very narrow, or maybe not so narrow, intervention where you're trying to change a particular behavior, what have you, so that you can make relative choices about this works better to that question. But taking that to scale, the question of how many slots do we need is a question that is completely different than a randomized trial, and it's unlikely that you would ever get the information needed to answer those questions from a randomized trial. The issue of Wisconsin, the fact that they implemented a welfare reform package without understanding the context in which it was embedded. The more information you have from a variety of information sources, the more likely you are to understand the context in which the proposed clinical trial is embedded, or the extent to which the clinical trial was conducted in a relatively controlled environment, and that controlled environment will no longer exist. Job employment training programs are a good example. They work very well when you're dealing with a handful of people who are being trained to accept jobs. But it may well be that the best thing to do to improve the employment opportunities for young kids is to make more jobs. Because if these newly trained youngsters come into the job market and there are no new jobs, what happens? They displace the people who would have taken those jobs, and now you haven't really solved the problem, although you have changed the mix of people who are now unemployed.
There's another example of changing context. Some of you may be familiar with something called the Child Parent Centers, an evidence-based intervention in the U.S. Arthur Reynolds has published lots of papers about it. It shows impacts on delinquency, education outcomes, all kinds of things. What's missing from those outcome studies is the fact that that was implemented back in the early 90s when the old welfare program existed and the mothers participated in the program with their children. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you look carefully, you see that many of those outcomes are mediated by, in fact, it was described as a multi-generational intervention. After 1997, in the city of Chicago, where those programs are implemented, that's not possible anymore. They have to work, right? So the idea that you should take the impact of the child parent center intervention seriously with another population in the U.S. at this point in time, on the face of it, makes no sense. But we don't always pay attention to those issues of context.
Right. We bring all these programs to Israel regardless of their success or failure.
Well,
Don't do that.
Yeah. There's a very good session being held right now on transportability in the next room. We don't want to send you away, but that is a huge issue. Well, in the U.S., I understand that the model of residential care is very different in Israel than it is in the U.S., but it's very easy to make a case that if you want to reduce the utilization of residential care, it has nothing to do with preventing kids from going in or getting them out faster. It has everything to do with shutting the beds down and creating no place for them to go. Because if the providers have this capacity and you start letting more kids out, somehow people figure out how to let more kids in, so that bed utilization remains constant. And these kinds of adaptations at the system level are things you have to understand that you can't possibly know through randomized trial, but they are very important with respect to creating the public health impact, which is to say, when you read the paper, somebody says there's been a noticeable decline in X or Y, and that in general is a positive thing for the public good. And then don't oversell the implications of the findings for policy, lest you get what you ask for. And sometimes, as these examples illustrate, it doesn't always work out in real life the way it did in the laboratory. And oftentimes that's part of the political process, is that you have to oversell in order to get a legislator to pay attention. And managing that political dynamic is a very important part of the politics of being in the game of creating change. And then the trade-offs, as Mark said, at the end of the day, it's not the researcher's job to make the choice. I would argue that in many respects, over the generations, researchers have had a problem with wanting to make the choices but not having the research to back it up. And that's, I think, in the U.S. for sure, that has made researchers bad partners for public policymakers because it led oftentimes to an adversarial relationship. From a research perspective, it's about the facts such as we know them. And our obligation is for the facts first and other parts of the game for later. And evidence and its various forms is an important part of engaging the public good for the good. Thank you.